Get started. Do I need to do something? Use the mic. Oh, I need to use the mic. Oh, I never use the mic. Sorry, I'm terrible about that. People online here. Okay. Hello, people online. So welcome to the session today. I'm Associate Professor Angela Ballantyne and I teach medical ethics here at the Med School. And today we are running one of the public health summer school days. And the great advantage of doing this, if you've never done it, is essentially you just get to invite people that you want to hear speak, come, and then a whole bunch of other people who are interested in talking about the same things come and join you. So for me, I've never met Victoria Metcalf before, but she was someone I was interested in and wanted to hear from, and we're just so delighted that you have had time to come and join us today. The overall theme of our day, and so about half people here have been involved in these discussions all morning, have been around the ethics of data use. And we held a day last year on data ethics, and some of the themes that came out of that were kind of increasing skepticism about the role of individual patient consent in relation to authorising data use. And so from there, the focus shifted on, well, how can we engage collectives, groups of patients and publics in this process, in this discussion about kind of data and science and research potentially as an alternative to getting direct informed consent from patients. And so Dr. Victoria Metcalf has a background in marine biology. She works as in the Prime Minister's Office of the National Science Advisor and has had 5 years doing citizen science and participatory engagement in science around New Zealand. So we're really delighted that you're here, and I'm really looking forward to hearing from you. There'll be about 20 minutes at the end, I think, for questions. So there should be lots of chance for discussion. Great.
Kia ora, Angela. Ko Victoria Metcalf ahau, tēnā koutou. It's great to be here and come up from Christchurch for the day for some cooler weather. I was just relaying in conversation. I'm interested to know how many of you perhaps have been involved in citizen science. Is there in either a professional or a personal capacity? So quite a number of you. Personal capacity? Professional? Okay, so a bit of a split. So hopefully this will be interesting. And normally I have give presentations that are very image heavy. There's still a lot of images in today's talk, but unusually for me there's a lot of text on my slides. And the reason for that is I wanted to give a variety of quotes that I think are pertinent to the points that I'm raising. And I wanted to make sure that the stuff that I'm talking about today isn't just a reflection of my own viewpoint, but is a collation of a variety of people's views in this space, including the literature. So there is some wordage to read, but I'll be talking about that as we go. So here's me as a young person. And I grew up doing a lot of stuff in the outdoors. And in particular, my father, who was not a trained botanist, so not a formally trained scientist per se, he was trained as a horticulturalist and wrote many, many books on native plants. But self-taught himself, I think, botany really, and about native plants. So we spent a lot of my childhood traipsing around pretty slowly, actually, after him as he stopped to look at a lot of plants in the bush and up in the mountains in New Zealand. So even though I can't recollect as a child whether I was involved in any kind of formal citizen science, I like to think that my childhood was actually, now reflecting on it, full of kind of informal citizen science that we were doing as a family. And so perhaps it's led me, thinking back on this journey, into what I do now today. As Angela alluded to, I sort of segued from a background in biochemistry and genetics at Otago, so I am an Otago, proud Otago alumni, into using those techniques and tools for marine biology with a particular focus on Antarctic marine species and looking at environmental impacts and adaptations to extreme change. So it's a lot of field work down in Antarctica. And I did that for years and lectured as well during that time period. But then I've segued through this sort of growing interest in science communication and more broadly, latterly into science engagement, into this role with the world's longest job title. So I'm pleased that Angela didn't read it out, but often when I go and talk to school groups and young people, I get them to see if they can remember my job title after I've said it. And so that is as National Coordinator of the Participatory Science Platform in the Office of the Prime Minister's Chief Science Advisor. And I think from memory there are 17 words in that job title, and yes, it does fit on my business cards, with some small, not too small a font. So a school group early on in that revelation about my job title during a visit decided that I needed a shorter name and one that was more approachable to young people, and so they voted and decided on Queen of Curiosity. And so I'll explain more about what I do as National Coordinator, or particularly about the platform, in a minute. But I want to say that this has been around now for nearly 5 years in 3 regions around New Zealand, and we've been funding these type of citizen science projects. But up until that time period, like all countries probably around the world, there's been a lot of citizen science activity, in the last 100 to 200 years. Most of it in New Zealand, and this is probably a trend internationally as well, has been very firmly focused in the environmental space, okay, and sort of ecological restoration. And it's really only more latterly, partly through the funding in our platform, but also through a general trend nationally and internationally, that we see sort of this foray of citizen science into domains like health and medicine as well, which is great. And yes, that picture on the right is me perhaps getting to do what not many people get to do in their roles. So I was invited to be a cheese judge for a day, and so I don't think many people can add that to their CV unless their job is actually as a cheese judge, and I'm not sure that many people have that title, but that was one of the projects that we funded, which was on students learning how to make their own blue cheese and alter characteristics to see how that influenced the colour, the texture and the taste. There was sort of a public health moment when 2 of the cheeses were deemed by Fonterra's chief cheesemaker to be covered in a bloom that was probably not of the same variety. So they were ruled out of the competition, thankfully, before I got to taste them. So let's talk about Curious Minds and the Nation of Curious Minds. So we had this document, which is freely available on the web, A Nation of Curious Minds, which was a strategic plan for science and society, which was released back in July 2014. And it was all about recognising the importance of science and technology to New Zealand and to New Zealanders and New Zealand's future, and looking at how we could use existing initiatives and create some new initiatives that would achieve some aims. And it came about from 3 offices or entities coming together, and they were MB, who provided the financial support and the steering of the Curious Minds initiative, our office, and also the Ministry of Education. So we have this tripartite governance structure. And firstly, out of that coming together of those 3 entities, we had something called the Great New Zealand Science Project, which was released. Some of you may have seen the sort of advertising and promotion about that. So that was a public-facing campaign to ask New Zealanders, what are the big things that we should be focusing on science and technology-wise for the next sort of 5, 10, 15 years? And out of that process of public consultation and media fanfare, we had the National Science Challenges, which I'm guessing that some of you might be involved in. Put your hand up if you are, because there's a few ones related to health. And so there were these 11 National Science Challenges or priorities that were decided on and funded. And although all of them to contain some funding and allocation towards that public engagement to do with that particular challenge focus, it was deemed so important to look at science engagement in the broader sense that it was decided that we needed to have this A Nation of Curious Minds strategic blueprint written up, and from that the Curious Minds brand was born. And a few new initiatives were lumped together with some existing work, and one of those is the Unlocking Curious Minds Fund. I'm not sure if anyone here has had funding from it. Great. And so that's sort of for more traditional style outreach opportunities using innovative techniques and particularly focusing on hard to reach communities, and that's a very broad definition of what hard to reach is. And then we have the Science Teaching Leadership Program, which is all about sort of empowering and providing professional development for our educators in the science space coming through, and also the Participatory Science Platform, or PSP. And I should note at this point that the PSP, I will refer to that in shorthand from now on as that, because Participatory Science Platform is quite a mouthful, and it was never actually intended, I'll let you in on a wee secret, to be an outward-facing name, but there you have it. So if you have new name suggestions for me, hit me with them. So the overall objective was this better engagement with science and tech across New Zealand. Within it, in government speak, there were these 3 new actions, or really sort of aims, objectives, and they are enhancing the role of education, the public engaging with science and tech, and the science sector engaging with the public. So that's sort of two-way thing. And what's important about the PSP is that it overlays all of those actions or aims. So it interfaces across as what's known as the integrating action. And it's been running since 2015 in these 3 locations, 3 regions around New Zealand: South Auckland, Taranaki and Otago, and I sit as a national coordinator. So there are entities in each of those regions that have the contract to run it in their region. In Otago, it's a consortium led by Otago Museum. In Taranaki, it's Venture Taranaki, which is affiliated with the council. And in South Auckland, it's an NGO that's called Comet Auckland. And so there's managers in place in each of those regions. They get given money to distribute, to give out to projects in the funding process, and I oversee all of that and liaise between the ministries and our office and a whole lot of other entities. And the thing about explaining what participatory science is, and perhaps a better question for you is, who's been involved in participatory sort of approaches? Not many, okay. So this is drawn from, the whole concept of this really came from Sir Peter Gluckman, so the previous Chief Science Advisor, drawing on a wealth of literature around participatory action research, which is a well-established method of research, particularly in the health sector, about engaging with a particular community and taking them on a journey through that research process. And this was morphing it into the science space. So it is an established and accepted form of citizen science, but it's a wee bit different from traditional citizen science, which is often or traditionally scientist-led. And so the scientist comes up with the project, right? And then they realise that they need some more, not necessarily expertise, but some more sort of personnel to make that science happen. So often it's in an ecological context, and it might be about inviting people to come to a particular place on a particular day and count or collect things. Or it might be about sitting on a computer and analysing photographs of Mars and deciding what sort of terrain they have, or counting penguins in a photo. So you're either they're collecting data or you're helping to analyse the data. And so the citizens are only traditionally involved at one particular sort of point in time. There's not much feedback given. They might get sort of updates on how the project's going, but they're not often really actively involved in the research process. So participatory science sits at the other end of the spectrum of citizen science, where everything is co-created and certainly co-designed with the community that is involved in the research. And that is what we do in the PSP. And when we're looking at our applications, we're looking for 3 key criteria. And they are, of course, you have to be doing some kind of science. So it's actual research as opposed to that outreach model of just giving people information and having fun with science and technology. And it has to be robust enough to stand up to scrutiny by peers, so in the science space, but it doesn't have to be like world-leading research, for example. You know, it's not necessarily NASA investing in millions of dollars. But alongside that, there are these other 2 criteria that have equal weighting. And one is that there has to be pedagogical rigour. And that's to do with the education aspect and saying that the education component is absolutely embedded into this process of doing research in science. And it's part of the communication of what you're doing as well. And so we often find that schools are central or involved in many of our projects, but not all of them, and I will give some examples of that. And then thirdly, there has to be meaningful two-way engagement. And engagement is a term that's thrown around so much these days, but few people know what it truly means to do meaningful two-way engagement. And that is integral, and part of the great success of what we're doing in the PSP is that everything is done with the community, and it's often led by the community. So we have funded now over 100 projects across those 3 regions, and they are incredibly diverse. So there's a lot of environmental projects. They might be tracking where your pet cat goes and what it's up to, looking at pest eradication programs, looking at threats to penguins or other marine species, but also more out there projects like what were the type of tools used to build these amazing, or carve these amazing motunui epa, these carved wooden panels in Taranaki Museum that are seen as an absolute tonga, and using engineering and other processes to determine that, through to air quality projects where preschoolers are testing a prototype device to see if they can both understand and use this device that measures 4 different aspects of air quality. So yeah, really very diverse projects. And I mentioned engagement just before, and you know, often in the science and the research space, we're so focused on that research process, and we see perhaps things like communication, engagement, and certainly education as other things, other aspects, add-ons. But to me, when I think about science engagement, the model that's in my head is very much this one, where engagement is about a continuum of those 3 aspects on a kind of spectrum together. So that if we're engaging fully, then there are aspects of science or research, communication and education all embedded. And only when those 3 things come together can we really effectively do research, I think. So as I said, lots of quotes interspersed throughout. So when I was prepping up for this talk, I went out to our regional managers and we thought about the kind of projects that we could talk about today and feature that would be relevant to you here as an audience. So I talked to our regional manager in Otago, Craig Grant, about ethics and data and concerns and our thinking around that, and this is what he said. So he said, I think the fact that many of our projects are inherently community driven or bought into by the community sort of mitigates against any of the data concerns that we have and that you might have been discussing today. So in other words, if the community wasn't happy with what was being put forward in terms of data collection or storage and use, the project wouldn't be greenlit because it hadn't gone through an outcome of meaningful community engagement that led to the go-ahead that this would be a good thing, so the green light. So it's very much in our projects based on this participatory approach and an opt-in basis. So there's no incentives given beyond the wider benefit that that community can see. So it might not even be individual benefit, that's something I'll come back to. And that, you know, we're pretty careful in our projects about anonymity of data. Again, this is something I'm going to come back to with maybe some controversial ideas at the end here, unless, of course, an individual wants to present their own data or case study. So I'm going to go through, I think, 5 projects now that we've funded that sit in the health space and talk about sort of data and ethics in those. One of these was an Otago project, which was about visually impaired people. And many visually impaired people, most of whom are elderly, underestimate the amount of light that they need to be to have in their homes to be safe, to function safely in their homes. So this was a project led by Mary Butler, a professor at Otago Project in occupational therapy, and it was about involving that community in a project where they could go on a journey to learning about light and what they needed to have in their own homes to be safe. And it was done in conjunction with occupational therapy students from Otago Project, so that they were working with those community members to develop lighting assessments or prescriptions for each particular person, that then that person could go and fulfill at their own lighting shop of their choice, and take on board their ownership of empowering their own actions around lighting and how to be safe within their homes. And it also involves some interesting older peer to younger peer learning, whereby third year students were helping to teach first year students as well within the study. The outcome of the visually impaired people actually going and filling their lighting prescription at the lighting store on their own was an unexpected outcome of the study. So originally it was designed so that the students would work and create this prescription, and then they would go manage the interactions in the shop together with the visually impaired person, the participant. But the participants throughout this participatory process came back very clearly with this idea that they wanted to have autonomy over that process. So there had to be an adjustment in how this project unfolded to accommodate the wishes of the particular community. This is what Mary said about data ownership within this project. So she said it was never an issue, and should agree with the previous quotes I put up. This was largely because the participants were all willing participants. They really wanted to be involved in this project because the benefit was to them and their community. And that she'd learned a lot about the need for a wide and deep process of consultation prior to the research getting going. So although this can be a frustrating, perhaps, and slow period of diving into research, it's pretty pivotal in participatory approaches that there is a reasonable period of consultation and continued conversation, so that all parties are comfortable with what's going to proceed and that they've all had a chance to input. And so I think what she says here is really, really relevant. It's all about ensuring that the relationships are real. Participatory research works best where there is a feeling that the research is just one part of a relationship that's genuinely concerned about the group and the individuals in a group. And that to me is such a key statement about how we can think about the research that we do collectively as researchers. Just one part of a relationship. So it's all about those building of those connections between people. And she talks about how she achieved that. So that was one project. Another project which sat in sort of the public health space was the Warm Not Wet project, which was also from Otago. And this was, its full title is Affordable Heating and Humidity Control for North East Valley Homes. And this was run between a community group called the Valley Community Workspace and the University of Otago. It involved ethics approval. 16 households within North East Valley were participants in the project, and 2 school groups, classes were involved. And what the households were doing were they were collecting temperature and humidity and age of house data over a time series, a period of 3 months, and analysing changes in temperature and humidity patterns. So North East Valley, if you've ever lived or been down there, it's notoriously sort of damp and cold and dark, and so healthy homes are a real issue within that section of Dunedin. And so this was an attempt to better understand what the issues were, inform the community about what they could change as a result so that they could have healthier lives. And surveyed what the homeowners were doing in terms of opening up windows or doors and what they were doing with respect to heating. In terms of the schools involved, so as I said, many of these projects involve schools that the previous visually impaired one didn't. It involved tertiary students. So one school, a class group, the intermediate school, they set up 3 miniature models of houses to simulate the water cycle within homes and the pattern of condensation and evaporation, and did lots of measuring around that, whilst the senior school that was involved helped to build the actual sensors that were then used in the participating homes. And 4 of those were also placed within the intermediate school. And the project team came up with something called the Home Dryness Score, which looked at sort of the surfaces starting to demonstrate condensation, such as window glass or door frames, and gave a sort of a valuable quantitative measure of what was happening within each home. And that score, so a higher score, meaning a drier house, was emailed to households weekly. And contrary to what the community actually thought was going to happen in terms of the results, they found some surprising stuff. Not surprising when you look at the broader literature, but that not all insulated warm homes were found to be dry, and not all cold uninsulated houses were found to be wet. And what I wasn't aware of, and visiting this project in action taught me, that there is a huge amount in your furnishings, particularly, of moisture content. Massive amount in your cushions and your couches and things like that. And that is actually pivotal to the water cycle and the moisture within your homes, and helping for a healthy or an unhappy home, depending on the levels of it. Now, in terms of ethics, Tim Bishop was the project lead on this, and with respect to the data, so they were very much focused on anonymity and using a third party to collect the data. But firstly, they found that people were really happy to contribute to the project because they could see a benefit for the community, but a benefit for them also. And in particular, they were thinking, they were going to update the community via this sort of snapshot every week of what the data was doing across the 16 households, but that the individual household wouldn't be able to see their data, it would be completely anonymised. But what the households actually reported to them is that they wanted to know the status of their home. They wanted to know what was in their home. So they were perfectly happy for their results to be shared broadly, as long as no one else could identify their particular home, but they wanted to know where their particular home was sitting. And so that was something that the group had to work with in terms of how they supplied that data back to them. But again, touches on this concept of, is anonymity always a good thing in research? And we'll come back to that. And that they also appreciated these weekly updates. So they weren't just wanting to contribute data and walk away from it, they wanted to be actively involved throughout the research process. And they received a weekly home dryness report. So the next project is a bit related to that. It's a Healthy Homes and Healthy Futures project, which ran up in South Auckland. And it was led by Rongamai School, but also involved other schools and partnered up with Landcare Research. And it was specifically focused more on mould, but was doing similar things in terms of collecting temperature and humidity data from homes up there as well. And within the school, a selection, a classroom of kids were involved. And there was a huge focus within this project because of the demographics of where it was held in South Auckland. There's a lot of stigma associated with homes and status of homes up there. So it's really important to this project group that the data was done anonymously, and so that the students could they were the active participants in terms of they were collecting the actual data from their own homes. It wasn't the scientists coming into their homes to collect the data. The students were taught how to do everything, and they were going and collecting mould samples and taking photographs around their home, and then that was then brought in as the data scrambled, so you couldn't see which particular home it came from. The students actually, I don't think, got reports on how their individual home fared in this project, which is a difference to the previous one. And the students were taught on why anonymity was really important as well. This one was had a diabetes focus. It's called Getting to the Heart of the Matter. Again, it was school-led by Manurewa High School, and partnered up with the Liggins Institute and also a variety of other entities as well. And what they were doing in this project was the students were looking at their heart rate, and they were using Fitbits to do this. And they were looking at it from a context of really high rates of diabetes in that particular community. What's a way that we can introduce the community to this problem, and how can they be actively involved in a solution to this problem? And so they were looking and mapping their exercise routines over a period of time and mapping their heart rates and doing some other work around their diets and tracking that. So the focus wasn't on health data per se, it was really just on the fitness data within the project. And one important component of the project was looking at traditional methods of Pacifica cooking, because this school is particularly high in Pacifica students and this community as a whole, and then using the same product, producing it via a healthy way, and having a chef demonstrate the two different ways of cooking, and then teaching the children and their parents the two options, and then tasting the food to see if they could taste a difference. Hopefully they preferred the healthy option, and it was then about empowering those people to produce food in a slightly different way at home so that it could impact on health outcomes. And the students actually held a diabetes expo, which was opened up to the community. So it was about them taking the knowledge that they learned in the project and sharing it with their whānau and the wider community. And then this was quite a similar project, but with a slightly different focus. So again, it came out of Rongamai Primary School, and it was looking at the science of school exercise. So if you've got kids at school, you probably know that, particularly at primary school, they have, often daily exercise routine that they're meant to do. That's often sort of a prescriptive program, and they're meant to get out and do it. But no one really looks at whether it's effective or not. And so this was about asking that question. And so it was about the students following a prescribed exercise program, which they've probably been following in the past, and looking at that for a week. Again, they were using Fitbits to measure their heart rate. And then they were looking at a student-designed exercise program. So the class got together to say, well, what do we want to do for exercise time? And they created that program. And then again, they measured that for a week. And they wanted to see if there were any differences. And the take-home message from the study was that the student-led design program was more effective for raising their heart rate. Perhaps not surprising, when you get people engaged in something, you get better outcomes. The data was anonymised, but because it was very much student-led, this wasn't the most rigorous study, but still really valuable, I think. And so here's some examples of some of the activities they're doing. There was lots of ball work and lots of running around and lots of gameplay, versus something that was more about, doing a set routine of moves, which is often used in schools. Key part of this was linking students to the technology and linking that back to their whānau. And so the students, whilst they were using Fitbits, had the opportunity to build their own sensors so that they could understand the technology that went into measuring your heart rate and using those Fitbits. And they could sort of test the equivalence and the working of that. And then they were invited to showcase that technology to their families and bring them into the school to engage the school, their families in the project. So that's sort of the health-related projects, but I also wanted to touch on where there's sensitivities around not disclosing information, particularly could be from a cultural perspective. In this particular instance, it's not so much. So one of the projects that we funded in Taranaki is called Project Reef Life. It's been an amazingly successful project that's won lots of awards, and it's about this offshore reef, which is 11 k's offshore, said to be in this area, sort of up for, opportunities for exploration. that's said to be quite depauperate, and yet these local divers and fishermen knew that this reef existed and was extremely diverse and a great fishing spot. And so they have taken the community on a journey where the school students have been involved. So divers have developed technology to mount a camera on the reef that takes photos and video every few seconds, day and night, year round. It's been a massive engineering feat. The school students are the ones largely analysing that data. So they're going through the photos and IDing all the species, working with experts to connect them to this ethereal place way offshore. But many of the students, the senior students, have also gone out there and done fishing surveys over some very treacherous waters and rough seas to get there to have that physical connection, that sense of place. Now, what's interesting is that this project, it's never been disclosed where exactly this reef is. And the reasons for that, because when this project came to life, they were told about the reef by a particular person, and out of respect to that person, they've never disclosed the coordinates. So even though a lot of stuff is uploaded into open access databases, the actual GPS coordinates are always obscured for this particular project. And we've just funded a second project, which I can't actually publicly discuss. It involves, it's scientist-led, but it involves iwi up in Taranaki. It's to do with the volcano, but some sensitive sites of cultural significance and geological significance. And so they will talk about it publicly when they're ready, but at the moment it's such a treasured and special thing to them that they're not ready to have that wider conversation, and that's absolutely okay by us. So what they sort of covered all of this. So it's really important for the project team to maintain good relationships with the fishers in this area. We hope that these relationships will lead to more information sharing in the future, and that this project is ongoing. There's won lots of awards, I think is a good indication of that. So for a summary about the Participatory Science Platform is that what we found is that not only does it engage people with science and tech and get them involved in actual research, but it also empowers and builds communities and builds those critical relationships, fosters those networks between entities that may not previously have connected, and that actually makes for better outcomes. And perhaps most importantly, and I haven't really touched on this, but what we see time and time again in many of our projects is that, yes, science and tech might be the initial hook that brings people into the project, but many of the projects also focus on a Mātauranga Māori perspective and how we can bring that alongside Western science and research approaches and how the two can dovetail together. And so it's an important part of the democratisation of science and that recognition and space for other knowledge sources, and that everybody has a part to play. So it's very much breaking down that model of the researcher is the expert in the room. In this scenario, everyone has some expertise and some knowledge to put together to help make a better research project. So I want to come back to Mary Butler from that visually impaired project and mention something that she said. She said in other areas of her research, she's increasingly finding that participants want to be named. Most topical in her research with Māori. In one project she's involved in, every single participant bar one asked to be named. It touches on data ownership and who owns the voice that comes through. So I want to briefly talk about anonymity. And a thesis by Bonnie Scarfe down in Otago was on bereaved participants in her research project for her thesis. And she found through going through this process of doing her degree that several of her participants, or nearly many of them, wanted to be named. And these were people that were dealing with the loss of a loved one. And they wanted to be named because it asserted the significance of immortalising those that they had lost, retaining ownership of the words that they had given, and maintaining a very public attachment to their personal identity. And the themes that she saw from the interviews were that this naming, this wanting not to be anonymous, was about memorialisation and memory making, about an openness in many situations on death and dying, because many of it was suicide related. That they felt that if they were named, they could more readily relate to the results because they could see themselves in the communication of that research, and it led to a sense of identity. And this is particularly pertinent in research with Indigenous peoples because of the history that we have had as researchers of research speaking about the Indigenous other. And when we're dealing in this space, the main concerns of the Indigenous community is around respect for their rights. They want control over the research processes, and they want that research to have some reciprocity, that meaningful two-way engagement, to ensure that there's equity, not inequity in the system. And that is really, really pivotal. And so that we can start to have this conversation around anonymity within the ethics space and within the research space is so critical, because we've had the status quo of we must make sure that people are not named, that is the right way to proceed, and yet we are having these groups come forward and saying, actually, no, I want to be named as a contributor to this piece of research. And so it's challenging the status quo, and that's a critical discussion to have so that we're constantly asking ourselves, what is the right thing to do in this particular situation? And it gives greater autonomy. So the last project I want to mention is one that's come out of Germany, and it has an element of participation about it, but isn't fully in the full PSP space that I've been talking about. It's called Tell Us. I don't know if any of you came across it last year, but it came out of an institute, and it's about in the orthopaedic space. So it was putting the question out worldwide, what questions about accidental injuries does research need to address? This was a form of crowdsourcing of what focus there should be on the next sort of areas of research in that particular specialty. And it was really interesting because they were wanting clinicians to contribute, but they were also wanting patients or families of patients to contribute. So they were open to the idea that there were lots of sources of knowledge. And they were very explicit what happened to personal data and that it would be held private. They were very explicit about how this would benefit the general population, about bringing in that greater sense of knowledge, source of knowledge into the research. Because, we can tend to get a narrow focus, but we can also then use this kind of approach to bring in some fresh new ideas that we, as a research community, might not have thought of. And they talked about what happened to the research questions that they submit, so that these were voted on or commented on the crowd as a whole, and then they took the results of that and decided which were the key themes that would then be the points of focus for research, and that there was anonymity within that. And they talked about how this would provide personal benefit. So they were building on sort of multiple layers of understanding. There was no ability within that project to, beyond that they would feed back via their website what the priorities are going to be. There was no ability within that framework for further contribution and iterative discussions. So the participation was very much at the crowdsourcing end. But I think it's a really valuable approach. So to sum up a few things, science and technology, I hope we all agree, is central to many of the global problems, including in the health space that we face. And I firmly believe that science literacy and participatory approaches are fundamentally important to our future. And in 5 to 10 years, I want to see participatory approaches normalised as a way of doing science and technology. Not perhaps the only way, but recognised as one of the key ways that we go forth. And that's because, and this might stir up some thoughts amongst you, science actually isn't objective. And I really like this blog piece from Raj Pandya on the Ethics and Equity Centre website, which talks about how we as researchers have dodged moral responsibility about the impacts of our science research and technology research for decades by appealing to the intrinsic morality of advancing knowledge, pretending that science is objective, whilst we separate what we discover from how it is used. And he referenced particularly in the environmental space, partitioning science from other ways of knowing, so not embracing those multiple knowledge sources and often holding it above other ways of knowing. That's their ivory tower scenario. And gatekeeping who can be part of science and who gets to ask scientific questions. And that is very much about the expert in the room scenario and breaking down that stereotype. So the recommendations, which I wholeheartedly embrace and say, in my own words very often, is that we need to pay attention to the applications and impacts of our work, especially negative ones. And in the health space, it comes back to that code of do no harm. Accept and embrace the imperfect nature of science. It is not absolute. We need to welcome diverse people, voices, perspectives, and even epistemologies. And we need to acknowledge that we have values which are making us not as objective as we think we are, or the science not as objective as we think it is. And we need to act on those shared helpful values. It's bringing people together under a common banner. So it is all about using community science for good, I think. And saying, he goes on to say that this approach grapples with ethical and moral questions about who uses science and to what ends, because the community is actively involved throughout the community science process. And by doing so, we access a broader range of values, ask questions like the Tell Us project that haven't been asked before, and avoid the inadvertent use of science to enhance inequity. When we design science with communities, community science allows us to grapple with moral issues, consider values and weigh options in a much larger and more inclusive context. And that to me is a really, really pivotal statement. So it's about taking everyone around us on a voyage of discovery and collaboration. And so key take homes from what I've just said, and I welcome all your questions, and hopefully I've given you some thought-provoking stuff. Where at all possible, I encourage you to use some form of participatory approaches with what you're doing. It doesn't have to be the full spectrum, but just think about how you can involve those who you are doing the research on and make it more a with scenario. Open access data in general, but there are reasons why it might not always be so, especially culturally. Research should do good. This should be a mantra. And we should always ask, when we're thinking about doing any form of research, what knowledge will the community gain from the study, and to whom is the researcher accountable? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I have like 50 questions, but I get to speak with you on the panel this afternoon. So I'm going to save my questions and open it up to the floor to see if anyone else has something to ask.
One of the things this throws up is the whole question of funding, and that the people who fund research do it because it means that the researchers will answer the questions that they want answered from their value base to enable them to make more money, I mean, being facetious. And that in a sense, this is a completely different approach to science. It's saying that science is the servant of the community to answer the questions which is important to the community. Tell me about funding.
Yeah, that's a really provocative statement and question, and I agree. It is about a paradigm shift about how we approach science and research. I mean, the good news is we have funded this approach, and we see that it's successful. So if one funding entity can do it in New Zealand, then I'm sure more can see that this is beneficial. And And so I think the key thing about early adopters is you've got to ensure perhaps that there's some data to point to a funding body and say that this is a reason why this is a good approach. And currently that's what I'm focused on. So yeah, watch this space.
Great, thank you. And can I just ask people to just quickly say who they are before they ask their question? Go for it.
Hi, I'm Mark Hathwaite. I'm a psychiatrist and lecturer here. It's alongside Ben's question, just following on from that, in that I heard a lot about community and involvement, and yet for many of us, you know, the whole idea of promotion, PBRF is about the individual, and it pushes us that way and pulls us from the very things you're talking about.
Yeah, and again, it is about that paradigm shift, right? So it's about thinking, you know, I think we've had this sort of mindset for a while now that science research is kind of a solitary effort, or that it's done in very small groups. But actually, research has always been a collaborative team effort. You can't achieve anything without really the involvement of a suite of people. And so this is, to me, just an extension of that concept and a reframing of how research is conducted. And again, I think it does come back to provision of data and good research and evaluation into why this is a good model going forward, and looking at the literature base from overseas as well that would show that there are benefits to the individual researcher that can support their career progression, that mean that from a PBRF perspective, that this is still a worthwhile journey to go on. And so it's probably like a chicken and egg scenario. Like if the funding body was on board, then that's more likely to drive up the PBRF ratings, but to get the funding body on board needs a body of literature in the first place.
We've got one question up here, but I'm just going to use my privileges to ask a little follow-up question. So one thing I was thinking about was one of the case studies in the US where researchers had partnered with patients who had a particular genetic condition, and as a result of that collaboration, the patient organisation were actually co-owned the intellectual property. So they were named as discoverers on the patent application, and that gave them real control about how the subsequent tests were commercialised. So when you talk about naming, are there any cases where the community partners have been named as researchers in terms of publications?
So in terms of the particular PSP, so the platform space, we're still a bit early in our evolution to be getting to that point. But there are a couple of examples. So in that mould project, for example, a follow-on project was looking at, or a related project done by the same class was looking at identifying some mould species, and there were links to also Kauri dieback, and the students were named on the publication that named a new species of fungi, for example. And so yes, they can be named as contributors, and I think we'll see a lot more of that coming through. But again, it's at the discretion of the individual project. Not all communities would want that outcome, but I think in that particular example that you gave, highly beneficial for that affected community to have some control and ownership moving forward.
So we had one question up the back here.
Hi, Nick Wilson from the Department of Public Health here at the university. I was involved in a sort of citizen science project involving school students collecting mosquitoes, and as part of a mosquito surveillance and identification project, and it went very well, but in the end it did finish for various reasons. But one was there was quite a lot of pressure on the science teachers, not to engage because of syllabus pressures and things. And so in the end, if we really want to get citizen science going, the school curriculum needs to have this sort of opportunity and space filled up, and science teachers given approval to engage in these things. Can you talk about that critical issue?
Yeah, it's a frequent discussion point for us, so I'm pleased that you've raised it, and I'd like to talk to you afterwards about the mosquito project, because I'm involved in an international mosquito project effort, so we might be able to do some reinvigoration to do with NASA. But on that particular point, yes, there is a lot of pressure on schools to do with the curriculum, and in particular, the new digital technologies curriculum places additional pressure on schools, I think, and they're worrying about how they can fit everything in. But what I've observed is that when schools fully engage in a participatory approach, and often if it's led by the schools themselves, that the teachers repeatedly report to me that this approach can span across the curriculum. And so if they're thinking about what they're doing creatively, there are no barriers. They are covering off every aspect of the curriculum. They might have a science and tech focus, but they're also ticking off te reo and health aspects, physical education, creative writing, maths. All of that can sit under the one umbrella. So I think the real thing is that that more broadly educators need training into how to take this inquiry-based approach and use it to make sure that they're covering the curriculum. So it's not placing additional pressure, it's actually making it easier for them.
Now, Leslie had a comment in relation to Ben's point about funding.
Leslie Gray, Department of Primary Healthcare General Practice here. In response to Ben, in terms of funders, just this week, I've been involved in two completely different projects, and one has had the feedback it will not be going forward because it doesn't involve enough participatory approaches and it's too researcher focused. And these are big books, these ones. And another one that's gone through to next stage of HRC because it is co-designed, I think, and it's very participatory. So I think we're already seeing a shift in terms of how to get funding. So I guess it's us researchers that are behind the eight ball.
Yeah, and I would add to that. I agree. So, you know, the hardest sector to win over in the space is the research community. It's not the community, and it's not the education sector. So it's about us changing our practice and praxis. And with respect to the researchers who are keen, you know, who have been willing to embark on, as early adopters on this journey, what a number of them have reported to me is that it's made them do better science as a result, because they're getting all this input, particularly from young people who have none of these societal filters and ways of thinking, and come in with this freedom of expression and ideas that you know, looks at a problem with a new perspective that is just so valuable from a research perspective, because the researcher goes back and goes, oh, okay, why have we been doing it this way? Okay, I'm going to take that on board and I'm going to change what I'm doing. So there are clear and hopefully measurable benefits, I think, for the scientists involved, which feed back into that PBR research as well.
I'm going to ask one, an issue we've been talking about all morning, which is about the secondary use or third or fourth time use of data. And what really struck me about your talk was just how important those initial relationships are, and that relationship of trust in terms of the data collection and generation process. And so I can see how that works really, really well. But a lot of what we talked about this morning is what about, you know, if you've got a data set that you've built up and you're retiring, what do you do with it? You know, if the patient feels really confident disclosing information to the clinician, but then other researchers are accessing that data, you don't have that relationship of trust. So do you guys have any experience about like what happens when the project finishes and who gets access to the data at that point?
This is something that we're grappling with, and I don't know how many meetings and workshops I've been in sort of behind closed doors where I've said, look, we need to have a broader conversation about data in New Zealand in this space. And it's not only about access to it or ownership, but also around storage. And so on the other end of the angle here is that when a project is community-led and that project kind of winds up, how do we ensure that that data isn't lost? How do we store it effectively? You know, so that it may have a secondary use. And how do we have that conversation? And how do we ensure that there's mechanisms in the New Zealand space that allow safe but protected storage of data? So it's a really big conversation that we need to have, and there are no fixed answers as of yet.
Please join me in thanking Victoria for speaking to us. Thanks very much, guys. Anyone who's coming with me, please don't run off because we need to shepherd you back